Ever wondered how the drums in a Tate McRae track instantly take you back to the early 2000s, but still sound fresh and modern? Today I'm breaking down the secret behind Tate McRae's Y2K pop revival and the production tricks at the heart of Tate's modern sound. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to pull off the same vibe in your own tracks. So let's dive in, but first, here's the example.
I wanna let my head down, while staring down your face, wanna go till lights out, take it right back to my place, you watch your mind. If you don't know what this is, I tell them one by one, show them one by one, twist my wrist. Buzz like this, start with a track, eyes on me, arch my back, just like this, here for the night, going by in, just keep watching. Buzz like this, move from the back, eyes on me, hey like that, just like this, here for the night, going by in, just keep watching.
Okay, so I want to jump right in with the heartbeat of this Y2K crossover sound, and that is really with the drums. So I'm just going to play them for you in solo. And then they're slightly different in the chorus. So let's first up have a look at the kick. One thing that we can notice straight away is that they're shorter, punchier, and I guess more transient heavy than kicks were in the 90s or 2000s. What I've done to kind of compensate for that, whether they did it in the original or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I've sort of chucked this layer underneath. So if you have a look here, and that can really give you that old school hip hop kind of sound. So it's a really cool way of blending that earlier sound with sort of more modern kicks and things. And so if we have a look at how we've processed the main sub, I've done my own thing with the processing here to get it to fit in my mix, but we're bumping a little bit around that kind of 75 where the fundamental's hitting, taking out some of around 431 with dynamic EQ to clean it up a little bit in those mids. And of course, giving it that sort of attack in around 1K. Again, you might not hear that on the record, but it's just a thing that I like to do to really get kicks to kind of pop a little bit more in the mix. One thing that, you hear a little more, I think, in modern kicks is that sharper attack. Even if you've got sort of a rounder, subbier hip-hop kick, you're still hearing that attack, and it's really cutting through the mix at all costs. So if we have a look, we're adding smack attack here. It's just in parallel, and we're giving it quite a bit of that transient, that front end that can just help it knock and really cut through the mix. And another element of the drums that I think is very 90s Y2K is the way that they would process snares. So very heavy on wide layering and rim shots, very sort of natural sounding claps. And what I've done in this particular remake is use rim shots, and this just really takes it back to that kind of 90s sound. Here they are in isolation. And they are following the kick pattern here, so it's a little bit harder to distinguish, but nevertheless is adding to that attack for the kick as well. What I've done underneath that though is add a drumline snare. Now this has fairly low attack, but it's really nice for texture. And again, a big thing in that 90s Y2K era. So if we hear just those snares together with the kick, you'll get something like this. And of course, the main thing here, I think a lot of unmasking is important, especially when you're layering a kick and a clap and, all sorts of different textures on top of each other. So I think it's important to be mindful of that. And what I really do to try and compensate for it is use dynamic EQ with the kick as the sidechain. Any frequencies that I feel are really kind of interrupting the kick or not allowing it to cut through as I want to, especially in a track like this, I'm just making sure that dynamic EQ ducks it out. Even if it's very, very subtle, it makes a massive difference. You'll see the kick data come through on the EQ in red. So looking at this again, I think the main place that really needed it was around that kind of 1K, because of course we boosted that on the kick itself. So it's just about choosing which element you want to prioritize for a particular frequency. But in this case, I really feel that, the kick is first and foremost and everything else is more or less supplementary. So another way that we're kind of modernizing these snares is using sort of a more modern trap sample, but again, layering it with a more classic sound like that drum line with very low attack. So this is one of the main snares in the chorus. And we're changing that pitch on every second. If we have a look, we've just layered that drumline snare on top. And it just gives it that old school sort of sound. Snares didn't really hit super hard. They were sort of less upfront, I think, in 90s and Y2K. The cool thing about Tate McRae is they've got that sound. Rhythmically, it all works in that era. But I think the point of difference is the way they're being mixed, processed, the sample selection, and really bringing some of those drum sounds to the front. One thing that you can do in your drums to really take them back to Y2K, I think, is use some of those classic sounds, but of course, process them in a modern way. If we have a look at the tom that's being used in the chorus, It's a basic 808 tom, but the way we've used it here, we've added some smack attack, but the way it's been processed in the context of the drums overall, you can really hear it hit hard with the rest of the other elements. If we have a look at the whole drum kit here and just really listen out for that tom. It's almost reminiscent of some kind of, reggaeton track or something like that. And it hits hard on that upbeat. It's not just a random kind of ambient tom hit or something, It really has its place. And you can do that with things, again, like transient design, the way you EQ it, taking out unnecessary frequencies that are clashing with a kick, snare, or other elements if necessary. And, bumping the fundamental just a little bit to give it a little more depth and a little more definition overall. So that really brings us to the drums overall and how we're going to process them. And so really, I think there are three core things that will bring your drums into a modern space. The first one being soft clipping. I think how you process it with a soft clipper can make all the difference in volume and how they kind of sit overall. So what I like to do as far as soft clipping is adding a soft clipper on my drum bus. This can be really nice. I like T-Rack's classic clipper for this. Be sure just to compensate for the volume. It just rounds out those peaks really nicely as opposed to a hard clip where it would kind of chop them off completely. This does a really good job of just giving you that volume and body without sort of going overboard and peaking unnecessarily. Soft clipping is great for that. I also love it on my kick drum where I'm really kind of clamping down on that kick on those peaks and making sure that I'm achieving that volume while giving it a little bit of character. As for the kick drum, let's have a look at that without any soft clipping or processing aside from transient design. And then adding the soft clipping only. Very subtle, but in context, it really helps it pop through. And then we go ahead and add, just in parallel, a little bit of drive, a little bit of crunch, and a little bit of extra transient design. And so soft clipping is the first of the three core things that I would do to really take your classic drums into a modern space. The next thing that I would do is really focus on balance. As you can hear, and you've probably heard it in my other mixes as well, I think it's really important to not only prioritize the drums in the context of the mix and sort of have it sitting maybe slightly on top volume-wise, but also in terms of the kick, just really making sure that that is anchored and sitting at a level that you don't need to change. And if you can essentially work backwards from that level and balance everything accordingly, your mix will turn out pretty nice. And that's a very old school trick, but I think it really rings true here, especially if you've chosen the right samples. And of course, if you want my new sample pack, just DM me samples on Instagram and I'll send it right through, totally free. And the third thing that we've touched on briefly is transient design. So kicks and snares didn't really hit that hard in that Y2K era. I mean, in a sense they did because they were very well placed and, the mixes were a little more sparse, but I think today, in order to sort of cut through a lot of those big synths and massive 808s that were, saturating quite a bit and things like that, I think that using transient design is an absolute game changer. I recommend using something like Smack Attack in parallel, just so you can still maintain the original characteristics of that sound. But between soft clipping, good balance, and using transient design to your advantage, you'll definitely notice a massive improvement in your drums overall. And so, of course, that Y2K bounce isn't anything without a solid hook. And that really comes from the vocal chops that we're going to look at next. So for this particular example, I have of course cut them straight out from the track. I did remake my own version, but didn't end up using it. This is what they sound like in isolation. Little bit messy. I had to cut them out from the original somehow. One thing I learned while recreating this is that the particular chops they've used here are what is creating the groove. So I tried creating my own version, tried replicating it as much as I could, recording it into my iPhone, but it still wasn't the same because they've used certain parts of Tate's vocal after having sung the actual track to create these kind of micro grooves within the melody, and it's really, really cool how they've done it. So if we have a look at what I did here, so look, it definitely took a couple of goes, but it just wasn't sitting. As you can hear, the way I chopped it up as well, it's a little more staccato. If you compare that to the original, which is so much smoother and just glides across the track, because the chops used are already within the pockets of this track. So really, really important to note, use chops that are going to work for your particular track. And don't forget that, of course, once you've got a small sample, you can repeat it, reverse it, and use plugins like Avox Throat. So this is a very cool plugin. You can add breath, model the throat, you can change the width of certain elements and really, really manipulate it to create something new. So if we have a look at my original without it, this is what it sounds like. And so what I ended up doing was changing the length, going a little bit further to the right, and same with the width. Just makes it a little less recognizable. And then just adding a bit of breath. And, the possibilities are really endless. I think that if you do it with a really well-recorded vocal, you'll have even more success, I think, with this plugin. So definitely if you're looking to achieve more of this kind of sound, I think experimenting with vocal chops, getting your singer to sing a bunch of ad-libs across the track, chop them up, reverse them, find the nicest sounding vowels and the ones that fit within the pocket of the track the most, and you'll get some really, really cool ideas. So listening to the drums just by themselves one more time. And then we add those vocal chops and see what it does to the groove. So it really kind of pulls it back a little bit and gives it that bounce. They're working together here. It's not one element or the other. So of course a Y2K inspired track and all of those vocal chops and rhythmic elements would be nothing without classic synth pads. The first thing that I want to show you is the chorus in solo, just the synths. And so as you can hear, the chords are simple. We've got a max of 4 chords here, and it's a really simple progression, just really allowing those melodies to shine through, the vocals and the vocal chop. If we have a look at verse 1, we've actually got something pretty cool happening here. I think this is definitely a way that they're kind of bringing this sound into the modern space with synths like this. This is what it sounds like in isolation. This is what it sounds like in context.
I wanna let my head down, thoughts staring down your face, wanna go till lights out, take it right back to my place.
So it's a super cool sound, and we're using a bit of sidechaining and some pitch bending, which is really, really cool. So if we have a look at the MIDI in Ableton, you just go to envelopes, go MIDI control and pitch bend. And what we're doing is basically gliding down from that top note. So the first time is a slightly higher pitch bend, and then the second time is slightly lower. Now, the main thing that you need to actually make those pitch bends a little more accurate is to ensure you've got the appropriate amount of headroom within the actual pitch bend on whatever synth you're using. You'll often see this -2, +2. If you're bending from top down, you really want to make sure that you have that headroom, so going up an octave or two can be really helpful. If you want to drag the pitch a little bit lower, say on an 808, do a glide downwards, maybe taking this down an octave would be the best option. And this is another thing we're doing on LFO Tool here. So all I've done is basically match the shape of what's going on the record. You can really hear it sync, come up a little bit, and sync again. And I'm using an 1/8 note rate for that, which is keeping it in time. So LFO Tool is a really cool plugin, especially for this kind of music. You'll hear it in some other songs on Tate's record as well, where you're getting a lot of that sort of classic 2000s stutter in a lot of those really sort of sawtooth synths and stuff like I Know Love and things like that. Very, very classic, but I think the way they're using it here is a little more modern. Again, just bringing it into the modern space, using modern sounds, even rhythmically kind of modern here and there. I think that's really cool what they've done. So of course, classic synth sounds I think are really important in this style of music. And so what I've done is use a synth called Massive. It's been around for so many years. This is a newer version of the synth. I just really wanted some classic chordal sounds, and this is what I found in the synth section. I mean, it just really sounds like a classic synth. It's really big, lush, can almost sort of venture into that 80s territory as well. So really very cool sound. And then I've layered it with something that has some contrast to it, but still on Massive X. This one's called 80s Essential, sounds like this. So it's a little more two-dimensional, not sort of as wide and lush, but of course, when you're layering synths, you really want that contrast. Definitely try to avoid layering 2 synths of the same texture or color, because that is really not going to give you width. Contrast is what gives you width. So on top of that, you've got this syncopated synth as well that sounds like this. Really, really simple. Gives it a little bit of kind of rhythmic movement, I feel, and really, really like that element and that sound. Then we've got just a basic sort of string pad sound on top. And just to make that a little bit less bland, I've added a bit of phaser, which can be just a really nice element just to kind of add some depth to an otherwise maybe plain sound. And it just sort of modulates here and there and gives it a little bit of interest. I've actually doubled it with this synth, which is a little bit brighter and a little more sort of, I think, reverb heavy. So here it is in isolation. So this is actually a pluck, but it's just drowned in reverb and sitting further back in the mix. And I think with Tate McRae style, that is a really cool technique and something you should try. A small pluck, distort it, add some reverb, and really just sort of let it sit further back in the mix and just add to the feeling of it rather than, a very upfront, obvious sound. So I've processed that with some RC20, just again to really push it back in the mix, taken off a lot of the highs and the lows, crushed it a little bit with standard clip, and just kind of drowned it in reverb. It's probably a little excessive, but the dry wet's all the way up. But it does, I feel, work here, and especially in this mix, because we've sidechained it, it's sort of secure in its rhythm and sort of staying out of the way of the kick and other elements. It works pretty well. And so I've left my favorite section till last. It wouldn't be a Y2K inspired track if it didn't have some really cool sounding percussions. The first bit of percussion that I want to show you is in the first verse. I think something that happened a lot in that kind of late 90s, early 2000s era was a lot of textured percussion. It had a lot of depth to it, and it was just kind of really fun and added so much bounce to, I guess, more kind of hip-hop inspired tracks. So I'll show you the whole drum section first here. So this is really cool. We've got just these sticks. And what I think makes them really stand out, there's a lot of focus on that kind of upbeat. They're not just straight semiquavers. There's a lot of rhythmic depth here, and I think it carries really nicely with the kick pattern. It's not just following the kick to kind of build on the kick structure. It's really driving the entire rhythm. So it's very cool. I used a plugin called Apocalypse Percussion. This is a really nice plugin, and I've just used the sticks, and I've just changed the pitch slightly to try and match something close to the record, turn the release down so it sort of gets rid of some of that room sound and things like that, and up to the velocity. And that I think is a really, really cool element. Speaking of that sort of upbeat and really putting some emphasis on that in tracks like these, we've of course got the hi-hats. They sound like this. And in context, you've got both that and the tom on that upbeat. And that's something that can really drive a track forward, not only in rhythmic elements like this, but also in your melodies. Thinking about how you can use that upbeat, not just the downbeat. So with the kick in isolation, we're just going to introduce each element individually. And it just does so much to add to it. Like, they could have taken a completely different direction here. They could have made it a more kind of four-to-the-floor dance type thing, but they really chose to add that kind of bounce and groove to it, which is so common in that Y2K era. These sort of classic hats that are sort of somewhere between open and closed. I think I've used open hats here, but just sort of adjusted them accordingly. There are two that happen. And then, of course, the classic toms and snare sounds that they're being really rhythmic with and sort of freely throwing them on those upbeats. So really, really cool in terms of the groove. One thing that you can definitely do to enhance that groove is highlight your MIDI tracks, press Command, and then right arrow. What this is going to do is nudge them slightly to the right, at least in Ableton. And this is just going to give you that extra bit of groove. It's going to take it from being something maybe a little more static and robotic to something that really has a lot of groove. If you listen to early Pharrell, you'll hear that kind of bounce and, for lack of a better word, maybe instability in the rhythmic sections. And it plays into how the vocal comes across, how maybe the writer might sort of write the top line over the track. Like, there are so many things that this can influence, and I think apart from just overall adding groove and a kind of natural organic feel to your tracks, it's a really cool way just to kind of set your tracks apart a little bit and add some interest rhythmically. And so finally, what makes that Tate McRae sound stand out in 2025? As far as nostalgia meeting modern production, there are a few ways that Tate McRae's done this. First and foremost, I think her vocal has a lot to do with this. So if you're listening to just the general timbre or sort of tone color of Tate's vocal, it just sounds fresh. It's very unique. So definitely the vocal delivery is going to play a massive part. Not to mention things like minimal vocal melodies and really simplifying a lot of those melodic lines is definitely going to give things a little bit more of a modern twist. I think the melodic structure here is really, really important and plays a big part in kind of modernizing these kind of tracks. And next, I think that sound design is going to play a big part in really fusing that nostalgic style with something fresh and modern. So in this track, we've used synths like Serum, even for things like 808s that I think do help bring it into a modern space using a sort of modern sounding big 808, and even down to different textures like respaces can make a big difference. So I'll show you the bass in isolation. So while some of those sounds are kind of reminiscent of earlier tracks in that era, I think with the samples used and different presets that you use, it can make a big difference, which brings us to how you mix these tracks is really what's going to give them a modern twist. So I think there was far less sidechain happening that was just for a utility. It was more used stylistically, but simply sort of using that to get the bass out of the way of your kick can be massive to just help that kick cut through, give you a more modern sounding mix. So if we look at Kickstart 2 here, although it's a very subtle duck, I am using it to create that space for a big round kick. And of course, that has grouped all of the respaces and things like that. So that's just one way that you can use the mix to really modernize your sound. I think the way we also use compression on the master can definitely help. I know some people don't like to compress their master, but I typically do, and I feel that it just really gives you a kind of fresh sound. So if we have a look at the compression I'm using here, it's somewhat heavy. I've sort of haven't let as many transients through as I normally would. I wanted that kind of cohesive sound, a little more dancey in the chorus as well. So I really wanted to tame those transients. And of course, we're using a really cool function here, the sidechain function. And so what this means is that the compressor's not going to react to that low end. So we're not going to squash those frequencies, which is something that you would hear. You won't get that depth in the low end that you get now. And I think this is a really cool way to do that. So definitely sweeping that low end and just letting the compressor react mostly to that kind of mid-range, maybe even less so the high frequencies. And lastly, don't forget to reference modern tracks. Even to get to this particular track, I definitely used Just Keep Watching. I not only recreated it, but I used Just Keep Watching as a reference. I simply purchased the song on iTunes and threw it into Reference 2, which is my favorite referencing plugin, and starting with one element at a time and seeing how everything sits together in the stereo field, of course, your volume and all different kinds of things, I think is a really great way to ensure that your mixes are staying in a modern space, or if you decide to take more of a nostalgic route with your sound selection and things like that. So with all of that, this is why Tate's track feels like a Y2K revival, but still hits today. Thanks for watching, and if you want me to personally coach you to take your productions and mixes to a professional level, hit the link below to book a free call with me. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.